Good morning. I'm Elaine Orr, and I've never been to this meeting. I'm so happy to be here, Margaret, and thank you for inviting me, and thanks for that wonderful event last night. Everyone who was participated. I was sort of drunk on North Carolina literature, and it was a good feeling. I was still sober, but really just drenched with that wonderful, we were in that wonderful Thomas Wolfe environment, and everything about it was so marvelous. And of course, being in Asheville is just wonderful. And hearing about Wayne Caldwell's role in the preservation of downtown Asheville, all those stories, and thank goodness Charles Frazier had a book for people to read from, and it all worked out. I love the way that happens, and I would like to second Margaret's, it's not an appeal, it's an offer to you to buy the most recent issue of the North Carolina Literary Review just to read Annie's story, which is a knockout story. I mean, when I read it, I thought, well, she spent several years in Japan, clearly, and I was so anxious to talk to her about her experience in Japan. And then it turned out that she'd done this wonderful assignment. And earlier I was talking with Kevin Watson, and we were complaining about the internet and how it interrupts our lives, but I'm thinking, if students can write like this because of some of the sorts of information that are available. I mean, I'm sure you can, it would be good if you could have scratch and sniff. I don't think that's yet available, because, you know, I felt like I was in that market, and that fish that was laid open, and those sunken eyes, and that orange surprise in the middle. I just love all that research that she brought into her story. So congratulations. It's really an outstanding story, and congratulations to the journal. I'm sure there are other people I need to thank. Well, I'm going to thank Wayne Caldwell and also Charles for the example of their novels from which I stole some things, especially words and turns of phrases, when I was trying to give a voice to a pre-Civil War cavalryman, and just some of the things that Wayne Caldwell writes. I mean, just the turns of the sort of rhythm of his phrases is really a wonderful thing to observe. And Pam's stories last night were amazing. So anyway, if I haven't thanked you, thank you. And let me talk a little bit about why I'm on this panel, I think. I'm a North Carolina writer who was born and grew up in Nigeria, and who did not really see the United States until I was 6 years old in Winston-Salem. And it was the oddest world. It was clearly foreign. I had come from a real place, which was West Africa, where things were normal. And you had a huge black world and a very few white people in it. And the white people were all American missionaries. Now, there was in our town of 30,000 Nigerians, there were 2 Britishers, and I thought they should leave. But other than that, there were just a few Americans. And then I came to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and this was 1960. And of course, it was quite a segregated everything. And so I went to an all-white school, and the churches were so white. I mean, the walls were white, the outdoors were white, and then we had sleet. And I just found it so peculiar. And then we could go home, thank goodness, to Nigeria. But as it turned out, I was destined to become an American girl, and I didn't really know that. Well, it actually turned out that I had 2 destinies, because if you're born in Nigeria, you cannot shake that off. If you're born and grow up in Nigeria, you're a Nigerian by Nigerian thinking. And my father went to some office in Lagos, I think, when I was a few months old, to change my citizenship. And the gentleman there stamped it and signed it like my father wanted him to, and then he said, "You can do this, but it won't change who she is." And so I didn't know that. He didn't know that. My parents, I'm sure, thought, of course, I would be just normal. But it was not to be. So I had this destiny to become a white Nigerian and another destiny to be a Nigerian North Carolinian, I guess, or something like that. And so what happened is I came to the United States and I tried to become an American, a white American girl, and I studied American literature, and then I went on and got a job teaching American literature, and I wrote books about American literature. I hate to tell you this, but I wrote 2 scholarly books about American literature, and then I was about to die, literally. I had end-stage renal disease in my 40s, and that's when I started writing something that really mattered to me. And I wrote a memoir titled Gods of Noonday, A White Girl's African Life. And it was a revelation. I have to tell you, if you have not yet written your life, you don't know a thing about it. It's when you write it that you figure it out. And I figured out these amazing coincidences about where I had been at the very time certain major things were happening in Nigerian politics. I thought I had grown up in a kind of white enclave in Nigeria, but the winds of revolution were occurring, and the nation was being born. And then there was a civil war that I lived through in Nigeria. And so I came to see how my life was intersected by these enormous currents in Nigerian political life. I discovered, for example, that the day my family drove to Lagos and were met by all kinds of roadblocks and young men with submachine guns who wanted to look through our luggage because there was a threat of total war, and we put my elder sister on an airplane to come to the United States. That day was the day that the first shot was fired in the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran War, you may remember. And I didn't know that until I began to research my history. So in the process of writing that book, my mother gave me the journal of a young woman from Georgia who had married the first Baptist missionary to Africa, to the entire continent, who had happened to go to Nigeria, who had happened to live in Yoruba land, which is where I was born, and who had happened to found with her husband, who was a former Texas cavalryman, first missionary to Africa, Southern Baptist. My mother gave me a copy of her journal. And so after I wrote the memoir, I thought, well, I'll write something about this woman, and I'll do this kind of creative nonfiction thing, and I'll fill in the gaps, and I'll do this research. Well, when I got down to it, I had to figure out why she had gone. Why this woman, whose father was a planter and who owned slaves in Georgia, had married this Texas cavalryman after knowing him 3 months and gone to what probably would be her death because of all the illnesses in West Africa at that time that made it the white man's grave. And that meant I had to write fiction, to try to figure out why she went. And of course, what did I discover when I got into this topic but the whole history of the slave trade? Here was a woman from Georgia whose father owned slaves. How far is she? Was in Greensboro, Georgia, not far from Savannah, Georgia, not far from Charleston, South Carolina, not far from my mother's back door, who had also decided to be a missionary and go to West Africa. It happened that the Southern Baptist Convention was formed over the issue of slavery, if you don't know that. And that it was formed on the notion that ministers should be allowed to keep their slaves. And the same year the convention was formed, they sent missionaries to West Africa. The characters in my novel, A Different Son. And I'm just going to read one little teeny snippet that shows you what is always in my imagination and what I am always wanting to write, and that is the movement back and forth across the Atlantic and the connection between West Africa and the American South. So in this little teeny passage that I'm going to read, the white heroine is, she has drawn a map of Africa, and she's drawn a map of North America, to show this Nigerian woman, it's not Nigeria then, but anyway, to show her where she has come from. Okay, so she's drawn Africa, she's drawn North America, and she's got the Atlantic Ocean in the middle, of course. The woman moved across the ocean to stand inside North America. She walked the line back to Africa, disturbing the illustration with her footprints. She scratched her head beneath her headdress. Its upward slant reminded Emma of a slave woman from back home, and the resemblance brought a torrent of memory. She thought of the little girl who wrote Jesus on a skiff of bark. There was a horrible complication in the drawing, and it made Emma terribly hot. The woman had walked the route of the slave trade, and it was Emma's own route. How had she failed to see this before? Something blue, a quilt, Uncle Eli's stars. Now the woman looked into the sky, not even sheltering her eyes against the sun. Then she held her hands palm down before her, arms straight, and swept the air. Jacob said, "She asks how you have seen this vision unless you have been in the sky." Thank you.